Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to OAG's latest webinar. It doesn't somehow feel like a month since we were last here, but maybe in other ways it feels like longer. So welcome back to our regular listeners, and welcome to anyone who's joining us for the first time. Today, we're going to take a look a little bit back at the summer season and how capacity has evolved, and then also how things are looking for this winter. I am joined, I'm Deirdre Fulton, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and I've been hosting these webinars for OAG for some time now. Someone else has been around for a while, John Grant. Welcome back, John, OAG's Chief Analyst, here to share your insights and thoughts on what's happening out there as we go. Welcome, John.
Hi, Deirdre. Hi, everyone. Good to be back. Big day today. Boeing employees are voting for a 35% salary increase. Who out there wouldn't mind a 35% salary increase?
I don't think there are many people that would say no to that.
It seems like quite a few Boeing employees are still not going to be happy with this, so it's going to be really...
Well, we're going to dig into a bit of that to come, aren't we, in our discussion. I'm also delighted to say welcome back to Eddie Piemczak. Eddie, welcome. It's been a wee while, hasn't it?
Thank you very much, Deirdre. Hi, everyone. Hi, Deirdre. Hi, John. Good to be back.
Hi, Eddie. Is that a helicopter at the back?
Yeah, to try and mix it up a little bit.
Oh, good. What's the value of that helicopter? About £5?
That particular one, actually, it's probably worth a little bit more than that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so Eddie, of course, is Head of Analytics and Advisory at Ishka, and very well placed to talk to us about what is happening in the world of aviation financing, and indeed aircraft delivery and supply. So we're going to get into some of that, because we can't really talk about what's happening in the industry at the moment without looking at that. So let's come back to the topic for a moment. As I said, we're going to look at how capacity is shaping up this winter with a bit of looking back to the summer. We're going to talk a little bit about how fleet shortages are impacting capacity and what we're seeing in Europe at the moment. There have been quite a lot of announcements in recent weeks about carriers withdrawing from certain routes. And so we wanted to just take a look at really what was happening, particularly between Europe and Asia. So we'll share some of that with you. And we've got some other interesting bits of information about cancellations and about then the sort of meat in the sandwich, if you like, aircraft orders and deliveries. So hit us with your questions. If you have them, you can drop them in the chat box, and we'll take those as we go. So let's get on with the first of our slides. So global growth. This is a usual familiar slide for those of you who join us regularly. Capacity for the year end is pretty much as we've been predicting through the past few months. It looks like we're going to end the year 6.4% ahead of last year and 3% ahead of 2019. So there's some positives there. We'll get those out on the table. But it's not all positive, is it, John? As you always remind us.
Well,
we're still missing. There's still a gap, isn't there?
There is, and we've done a lot of references back to 2019, but just for devilment, I went back to 2018 to look at the winter 18-19 period, because winter 19-20 would include February and March, when part of the world was closing down, if not all of the world was closing down with the pandemic. And we're 5.6% up on winter 18-19 in terms of global capacity. But at the same time, that's 5 years ago, and 5 years of aviation growth is normally between 3 and 4%. So we really should be in about the 15% region for global capacity growth, with some regions growing faster than others. And obviously from the data, you can see that's not happened.
Yeah.
But the other thing The other thing I think which is important is that in the second half of this year, some of that capacity discipline that we've seen through 2023 and the early part of 2024, which resulted in those outstanding airline profits, has begun to break down, and we're seeing more capacity being added, and that aligned with a weaker economic situation in some places, the end of revenge spend, and we're beginning to see yields softening, and that's a concern at any time of the year, but certainly going into the winter. The flip side of that, and the good news side for you, because you like good news, is that the price of oil is extremely cheap at this moment in time, with people reporting a glut of oil for 2025. So airlines are unlikely to get hit with an extreme spike in oil prices in the next 12 months, unless something even worse than what we see geopolitically happens.
Okay. So there's a little bit of optimism amongst.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, things are better in some
We're not in a
parts
bad
of the world.
shape, are we?
No, we're not.
Yeah. So let's go on to the next slide. We're taking it down to looking at the regional level now. So, and this is, I suppose, where there's a start of a little bit of some of those issues that you were alluding to there, John, in terms of demand softening, perhaps. What we've got here is capacity by region year on year. So this winter versus last winter. And although the winter season runs to March 25, we call it winter 24. Just for those of you who are not used to hearing us talk about summer versus winter, and these are IATA seasons. I suppose technically we should say winter 23-24, but anyway, we know what we mean, year over year winter season comparison. And then, as you said, John, we've also taken a look back to the winter before the pandemic, which was actually winter 2018, which started in October 2018 and ended in March 2019. So free of any COVID-related issues. Well, that none of us knew about it, if there were any. So what this is showing, I guess, is that all pretty upbeat versus last winter.
Absolutely.
Some pockets of strong, sort of above trend growth in Asia Pacific and Europe. So that all kind of looks quite optimistic. Latin America as well. There's some strong growth happening there, and a bit more steady through the Middle East, Africa, and North America. Although that's quite a
well, that's the reason,
a strong
for this.
position.
Yeah, that's the reason for this break in the capacity discipline that we've seen in that particular market. Pressure we're now seeing on the ultra low cost carriers, the likes of Spirit, who rumours have it that they're preparing for some sort of refinancing program. And if you look at the Middle East year on year, you might be saying, well, why hasn't it grown? Because it's always grown. And the answer is it came back quicker than any other part of the world. So that capacity was already up and back. And anyone who's following the discussions between Boeing and Emirates, and indeed with Qatar Airways, will know the frustration the airlines have at the aircraft manufacturer non-delivery of new aircraft, including the 777, which is important for them. But it's when you look back to 2018 and you see that the winter capacity in Europe is actually pretty close to what we're going to see now. There's not much difference at all. In fact, it's still slightly down on 2018. Why is that? Well, we could have a whole webinar about operating constraints at airports, capacity caps, markets losing their domestic activity. Germany, for example, where domestic traffic and domestic services have been dramatically cut. Lufthansa's network being rationalised. All sorts of things that have meant basically we've lost 5 years of growth in the European market. Will that mean that we'll still see high airfares this coming winter relative to 2018? I think we probably will. I mean, Michael O'Leary called it, and he always calls it, doesn't he? But we're not going to see a return to the £5 or €5 fares, certainly for the next decade. They are
those heady days are behind us, aren't they? I think, and I keep talking to people who are planning summer holidays for next year, and they're sort of saying, should we hold off until the prices come down? And every time I have that conversation, I sort of say those days have gone. The days of the last minute bargain, I think are behind us. Don't get me wrong, there might still be some out there, but I think people are learning that when you see a good fare, you got to grab it, or a good offer, you got to grab it. You've been championing that cause for years, haven't you? So
I think that's always been my advice. I think if it looks like a bargain, it's worth grabbing. Get hold of it and get your sun cream ready.
Yeah. Certainly not sun cream weather in the UK now. We can certainly say that for sure. So let's come back a moment to the US issue that you were kind of pointing out there, John. Where do you see that going? So because that does feel, it doesn't, relative to others, it doesn't look as dramatic. But that is quite a shift, isn't it, upwards?
Well,
in the US.
I think you've got. I mean, in some ways, we're going to move on and talk about aircraft deliveries and things. But the US airlines have been, and particularly the low-cost carriers, have been taking deliveries and bringing that capacity in. And in some ways, it's a battleground between the legacy and the ultra low cost, and the legacy are able to move capacity into international sectors. So, notwithstanding the fact that the dollar is very strong versus the pound, what we're seeing is more European capacity coming on from United and from Delta and from American Airlines, because it takes them away from competing with the ultra low cost carriers. But the other thing, of course, is those legacy carriers have got so much capacity and they've got the strength of the hubs that they can actually afford to revenue manage and compete for those ultra low fare passengers alongside the Spirits and the Frontiers and the Allegiants. But they can put themselves in a market, but they can take themselves out of the market much quicker than those low cost carriers. So I think subtle switching of capacity to international markets has been very positive for the legacy airlines, but it's left this sort of trail of carnage behind it, where airfares are coming down, and not just the legacy carriers, but the ultra low cost carriers are struggling. And they don't have the critical mass, those ultra low cost carriers at particular airports. They're always looking for new markets and new segments, and it's becoming harder and harder for them. There isn't an equivalent of a Stansted or an equivalent of a Paris Beauvais or a Frankfurt Hahn, where they can go and be different and really disruptive. They're competing head to head in the same airport, and sometimes even literally across the ramp from a legacy carrier. That's a tough space to be in.
Absolutely, especially when that legacy carrier has got big deep pockets and an extensive network.
And shareholders that it's got to appease, and it's not going to give ground to anyone.
Interesting. Okay, let's come back to the deck. So we saw, actually, just coming back a slide, Asia Pacific strong year-on-year growth, and reasonably strong position versus 2018. Now, a big significant contributor to those capacity totals is China. Hence our next slide. So we can't really look at this winter without looking at what's actually happening in China. We've got capacity actually up 15% compared to winter 2018, which is on the face of it a positive. And actually just this winter there's a 5% increase. But this is not This is not just international,
this is
is it? It's domestic and international.
This is one of your slides where the headline number doesn't tell the story, does it?
Yeah.
You know, this 5% increase in this winter and the 15% since 2018 hides something I've never seen in the airline industry, and it may have been caused by geopolitical events, or they may be a factor. But what has happened in the Chinese market, and particularly the Chinese international market, is mind blowing. I mean, you know, there's TV documentaries we made on this, I'm sure, because of just the way things have flipped and changed, and whether it will actually work or not. You know, there's a lot of investment and risk being taken by the Chinese passenger airlines. And to answer Peter's question, no, this doesn't include the cargo carriers. So, you know, there's even more if you wanted to add
scheduled capacity, isn't it?
Passengers. But you can see, you know, keeps growing and growing and growing. And I think we need to remember the international share of capacity for China is now down at 9%. It did reach 12%, but the vast volumes of capacity and demand are still in the domestic market.
And that strikes fear, I'm sure, into all of those destinations that are still somewhere in their plans, banking, hoping that the outbound Chinese traveller will return in the volumes that they once were. You know, we saw right through the pandemic, didn't we, that there was this sense that this market just had to reopen and it was coming back. Headline, these figures tell you that certainly in capacity terms, it's not happening yet.
No, it isn't. And, you know, it's not going to happen for the next 5 months at least, because we're heading into the winter program. You know, and we might see a peak period of demand around Chinese New Year, but again, it will probably be more domestic than international. And if it is international, it will be regional. So, you know, we're all wondering what's going to happen summer 25, but with no real confidence it's going to be better than summer 24. And that's not good news for China PLC, but it's also not good news for the whole airline industry because of the behaviour and some of the things we're seeing from the Chinese airlines at the moment, which are extremely disruptive to the broader aviation market.
So on that very, sorry, Eddie. Yeah.
Just on the China front, I mean, they've not been taking as many deliveries in the last few years as they would have wanted to, you know, for various reasons, and Boeing's situation included. So if they're increasing capacity, they've probably not been retiring aircraft or replacing them to the same extent. So there's a bunch of aircraft in that fleet which is growing slightly older as well.
Yeah, and I guess as we'll see and come on to talk about, you know, the questions that or the operational challenges that brings for carriers in terms of maintaining on-time performance and just operational reliability becomes challenging, doesn't it, when you're working with an older fleet? But particularly, well, there's all sorts of aspects to it, aren't there, in terms of the product that you're offering versus your competitors, and the traveller's perception about that, but then also just actually having aircraft that don't need or that need more maintenance becomes a challenge the older the fleets get.
Yeah.
So okay, so and to just pick into the China issue a bit more, we wanted to look at China to Europe because we've had a slew of European carriers coming off China services, largely because of the overflight issue with Russia and Ukraine. It's just not economic for carriers to operate in the market. So we pulled some data that looks at the position for this winter, and this is just China to Western Europe. there's a raft of routes operating, aren't there? I mean, this is like the heady days. This is like the heady days of
2017 and
2017,
18,
2018, when we had almost not every regional point in China, but a lot of regional points in China serving a lot of secondary markets in Europe. What is going on? What's behind
well,
this?
what's going on is Chinese airlines throughout the pandemic, they inverted and they were operating domestic sectors. Their costs were still in hard currencies. Their losses are phenomenal. If anyone wants to look at the losses for China Southern in 2023 versus, and indeed the big three Chinese airlines versus what other airlines in the world were producing, they were absolutely appalling. There's no other way to describe it. They were horrendous. And you may say they were later in the pandemic and their government was more restrictive. It doesn't matter. But Chinese airlines have turned their attentions to Europe because the political situation with the United States is so bad that there is very little air service between the two countries and very little hope of it changing. There is an open skies agreement with Europe. They have the competitive advantage of flying over Russian airspace. They have an operating cost base that's between 30 and 40% cheaper than their European counterparts, who are having to fly through Southeast Europe and through Central Asia to reach these markets with 3-hour extended block times in some cases. And so, we've seen carriers vacate Beijing as though it's got another outbreak of COVID. We've got BA who've gone, we've got Lufthansa who's gone, Virgin's gone, SAS have pulled out. All of the major carriers have pulled out because load factors are circa 55% and lower fares is not what these airlines are about. They're trying to behave sensibly. And the Chinese airlines believe they've spotted an opportunity to generate some hard dollars or euros and have flooded the market, but the market hasn't responded. I mean, in winter 2018-19, the capacity balance between the two was about 56 versus 44 in terms of share. At the moment, 82% of all capacity is being operated by Chinese airlines. This week, Hainan Airlines started a new service between Vienna and Chengdu. Now, sorry.
What do they know that we don't?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
no slight on Vienna because it's a lovely city. But it's winter.
And, in business class, I'm sure you can put 5 or 6 pandas in there, and everyone will be happy. But there isn't enough demand for it. And I've got, near where I live, I've got Chinese airlines, 2 Chinese airlines flying within 5 minutes of each other between Shanghai and London Gatwick. Why? What's it about? And and the European airlines have looked at this situation and said, enough is enough, and we're out. And they're not going to come back for a while. And the likes of British Airways, you would employ 2, maybe 2.5 aircraft on a Beijing route. And this winter, if you deploy that to Cape Town, strong leisure demand between now and the end of March, with high fares and with some business leisure component to it, with cargo in both directions available. Why would you not take that opportunity rather than fly to Beijing, where you're not going to be competitive and the market is flat? It doesn't make sense. So
reading between the lines here, what you're actually telling us, that we should all be going to China this winter because there are potentially bargains to be had. You might have to go somewhere in Europe to do that, but
I'm not sure. You're not attracting me with that proposition. But the other part of this is, and the US carriers have gone the other way, and so the American carriers are coming to Europe. And just to correct, as Petri and Wilco said, sorry, it isn't open skies. It is individual agreements between all of the European countries. Nice to see they were listening, though, in both cases. So, China's becoming a wasteland for long-haul international airlines, and particularly Beijing, where they can't see any short-term recovery, and they're investing elsewhere in their networks.
It's always going to be a challenge, though, isn't it, when you've got such a robust domestic market from a carrier perspective, and it's the challenge for any airline, isn't it? And you talked earlier about how the US legacy carriers are, have the ability to be opportunistic in terms of serving some international LCC markets. In China, my sense is that you've got an even bigger, more robust domestic market that could suck all of the capacity that you could throw at it.
And that's what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That grip and that encouragement of cheap fares. But cheap fares, yes, it can be absorbed in the domestic market, but if it's at really low fares and you're in an industry where most of your costs are dollar denominated and you're earning Chinese yuan, doesn't make for a very long-term position, does it?
Eddie, what's your take on the lay of the land in an aircraft, from an aircraft perspective in China?
In China, well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, they haven't been taking too many new aircraft, and some of the wide bodies that were grounded are now back in maintenance. So they're obviously keen to put them back into service. I think the point John mentioned earlier about the hunt for hard currency is probably one of the drivers there. So putting aircraft back into service, taking the opportunity, into a market where the Europeans are struggling to satisfy, is driving some of that picture. But domestically as well, I mean, they've increased their domestic capacities and services, and they're doing the international as well. Trans-Pacific is out of the picture in many respects. So Europe's the next best call, I think. And so aircraft are coming back into service on that front.
I mean, there are attempts by the Chinese administration to exert some influence, and Petra's asked the question, what's my take on the CAAC's new 3-7 airport policy, which came out in September and surprised many. I guess my detailed answer is happy to share with you for a piece of consultancy work, Petra. But horse stable door bolted strikes me as part of the problem, because a lot of this is already there, and ultimately this is what the Chinese airlines have got to do, and it's going to be very hard to rein it all back in.
Just for context, John, we had a number of conversations at Roots with people about this. Our take on the 3+7 is that this has partly been driven by, the desire from the Chinese government centrally to not have a repeat of the situation where we had the huge raft of regional connectivity from secondary cities and tertiary cities in China across Europe and North America.
Yeah.
with significant subsidies to support these routes, because there wasn't a huge amount of demand for them at the time. So there's a concern, I think, centrally about pouring more money from regional governments or route development funds into these kind of services. But you're right, there's a bit of a disconnect, isn't there, in terms of that policy or an aspect of that policy being about controlling that or trying to control it, versus what we're actually seeing here, which is just all bets are off.
Yeah, in a controlled community, it's very surprising to see the left and the right hand so disconnected.
Yeah, I sort of want to travel a bit around Europe this winter and see just how many outbound Chinese tourists there are. Because that's the concern, isn't it? That we've got all of this capacity that's come in, and actually, what are the load factors going to be like on these routes? Maybe we're too cynical.
There's an interesting point that Saeed makes about why is China attempting to take a greater share of the supply? Is it to attract Europeans? Well, it might be to attract Europeans and to reignite the Chinese inbound market from Europe. But the fact is, that is not the airline's responsibility. That is a brand and a perception and a huge marketing challenge that the Chinese Tourism Board would have to take on. I mean, I get immensely frustrated. I mean, you mentioned about routes. The amount of Chinese airports and cities that have very expensive stands at routes that would have cost them $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, and teams of 10 or 12 people there who were telling me that a city has 6 lakes and it has a mountain 20 miles away, but wasn't telling me as an airline how much corporate demand there was, what corporates are based there. And some of the key points I need to know, they are so off message with the airlines of Europe at the moment. It's incredible.
I think it's always been a heavily skewed market, hasn't it? Although I'm interested by your stat from earlier about only 56% of in 2018, only 56% of capacity was operated by Chinese carriers. Because in my head, it was a higher.
Yeah, but you forget all about the Finairs. You forget about the double daily Beijing.
Yeah.
All of those things that were going on that are no longer there.
So, if you step back and look at it from that perspective, maybe Saeed has a point in that this is a land grab by the Chinese carriers in an attempt to switch back on the volumes that were there before, and it's not just outbound; it could be inbound too. But I don't know. I don't know whether the market in Europe is ready for that yet. I don't know.
Only time will tell. Yeah, we'll see at the end of the winter.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, let's come on to the next slide, which is just a bit of a putting a flag up about great. We're seeing ambition and strong growth to Europe in particular from the Chinese carriers, although some of that is about redistributing from other markets where they're not operating to. But there's a significant challenge in the industry that really emerged as we came out of COVID, and partly because of the Pratt & Whitney issue, engine issue. But we started talking probably a year into COVID about the supply chain challenges that were out there, from all aspects in terms of the availability of skilled resources. Lots of people took the opportunity to either retire or leave the industry, or were exited from the industry because companies let people go. And the knock-on effect that had in terms of having skilled MRO resources who understood exactly the intricacies of maintenance on particular aircraft types, through to the supply chain of actually getting parts in a timely manner, has just kind of grown and grown and grown, hasn't it? It hasn't. I think perhaps naively, I remember at the time thinking, okay, this is another hurdle for the industry to overcome, but we'll be through that in 12 to 18 months. But here we are, 12 to 18 months later, still hampered by some of these things. The stats here show that, so this is just a snapshot of the total fleet split down by region. And at the moment, 16% of that fleet is inactive. Now, some of that is aircraft that are parked up, never coming back into service. And we can see that in the breakdown here, which shows that inactive is comprised of maintenance, stored, and on repair. But actually, of the global fleet, 7% are out for maintenance. Now, Eddie, we were talking earlier about is that normal? How we haven't got the past data to kind of say is this higher or lower than it normally would be. But your view is that this is high, isn't it?
It's high, but I mean, as with each downturn that we've had in the past, what you tend to find coming out of it at the end is the number of aircraft that are considered in store doubles, and then slowly whittles down as markets recover. And we've got that kind of position now as well. What's maybe slightly different at the moment is a lot of those aircraft that are parked. I think at least half of them are about over 20, 25 years of age, and not necessarily part of the ongoing inventory in terms of aircraft going forwards. And then quite a lot of them are waiting for maintenance to come back into service again to provide cover for the new aircraft that aren't being delivered.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a queue there as well for the supply chain shortages and the skill shortages that you mentioned. And again, I think of those Pratt and Whitney impacted aircraft. I think just on the A320neo family, there's about 420 still parked up, waiting for their turn in the engine shop. So
I mean, it's scary, Eddie. Deirdre and I were at an event. I think it was in about April, and Peter Elbers, CEO at Indigo, said, he sends an A320 in for a regular maintenance check. He has no idea when he's going to see it again. If anything untoward is found, that's got to be taken on board and repaired. Spares have got to be found. Those spares are not available, and you lose aircraft for a long, long time. Volaris, Mexican low-cost carrier, 40 aircraft. Was it 40% of their fleet are grounded at the moment because of engine issues? How do airlines manage to operate a network when they've got such challenges? Wizz Air has got a similar challenge. Every airline in Europe has a challenge with its fleet. If it could be the A220, I mean, there's issues with that as well at the moment, and their engines.
Yep, they're all in the same boat in that respect, especially if you've got those aircraft, and most people do have. So it's just something that they're compensating for the lack of access to those is not just pulling into service stored aircraft, but extending leases on aircraft that they were going to retire. I mean, that's one of the pictures that has changed is we haven't had wholesale retirements this year or last. Because a lot of aircraft leases have been extended. And so those aircraft are still flying longer than they maybe would have been otherwise. And the ones that have been retired, they're just being harvested for parts, engines and spare parts to keep the active inventory going as well. So you're seeing some of the smaller aircraft, variants of like the 73 or the A320, the 319s, etc., being parted out just to support the larger, the larger brothers and sisters in the stable. So airlines are finding a way around it, but it's not. I won't say it was a cost-efficient way of doing it.
Yeah, I mean they're robbing Peter to pay Paul, aren't they? Literally.
Yeah. So yeah, fares will have to company.
In some ways, this is the irony of this situation. The airlines on one hand want their aircraft to be operating, but actually we have an artificial demand supply constraint, which, as the market softens, might actually be a benefit to the airlines because they're not going to be able to produce as much capacity as perhaps they wanted to or could in normal circumstances. And at the back of their minds, they're probably thinking, we're going to be getting quite a bit of money from Boeing or whoever for non-performance further down the road as well.
Silver lining then. A silver lining,
cloud,
maybe?
Every cloud.
Yeah, every cloud. Okay. Let's come back to the deck for a minute. So I guess all of those things, we've got another slide here just on Europe. I guess all of those things are impacting on the decisions that airlines are making about how they plan for this winter. And what capacity they put in this winter, aren't they?
Yeah, every airline has had to make some adjustments, and some have made them at really last-minute.com type decisions, like BA dropping Kuala Lumpur.
You're not sore about that at all, are you?
I'm not sore about. I'm not sore about that at all whatsoever. I mean, telling you 4 weeks before you're supposed to travel is fine, but
at least it was 4 weeks before, not the day before.
Yeah, well, and dropping Gatwick, New York for the winter, and other minor schedule changes. I completely get and understand why they've done it. Why they didn't really protect people on Malaysia Airlines and tried to send you with Qatar Airways, Malaysia or a One World partner as well. I don't know, but Finnair, they've leased aircraft out to nearly everyone. If you want to fly from Singapore down to Australia with Qantas, you might well be sitting on a Finnair aircraft at the moment, and they've leased out their parts of their short haul fleet as well. So there's a lot of capacity and fleet reaccommodation and subleasing and activity going on to try and keep us going. And of course, the irony of heading to the winter is this would normally be a period when many airlines would accelerate their maintenance work and bring more aircraft in for maintenance. But that ain't the case this year.
But I think the challenge, as we were just talking about there with Eddie, is that all of that maintenance is obviously still there and is only going to increase as airlines are stretching the life of the aircraft that they've got in their fleet. I mean, there was a story, wasn't there, just this week or last week about Emirates now extending the life of the A380s. That we're going to see more of that, aren't we? We're going to see much more of airlines making do with what they have and trying to make the best of that situation. But that in itself increases the maintenance burden, doesn't it?
It does, but
the older the aircraft get, the more maintenance they need.
Yeah, they do. But the important thing about the Emirates A380 decision and to extend their life is we've still got a chance to get a shower.
Oh well, it's all good then.
All you need is a first class ticket.
Is that the royal we?
Well, all of us are just as available to fly first class if they want us to.
Yeah.
Not all at the same time, I hasten to add.
No, I've reached for some. Okay, let's come on to our next slide. So this is just a bit more detail on some of these network changes, which are pretty dramatic, aren't they? Looking across, we've got Air France and BA here, and this is their wide body international capacity, summer 19 versus summer 24 by region. So we can see the shift there. You've got Air France with a bigger program to North America, but there's that reduction to China. It's the other side of the 10,000 additional flights from Chinese carriers into Europe. Similarly, BA, we've got a significant reduction to Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia as well. That's your Kuala Lumpur.
Well, it wasn't quite 300,000 seats, but it's and they've dropped one of their Hong Kong services as well, and downgraded that to 787, I believe. So there's lots of changes taking place across the carriers. I think we understand why they're doing it. You can see where they're focusing their efforts. It's a lot of it is around North America and the strength of the North American market. Who knows what's going to happen there with an election coming and what the outcome is. Hopefully it doesn't have too much of an impact for anyone or any airline.
Interestingly, Lufthansa's a little bit of an outlier, isn't it?
Every sense of the word.
There's a lot of negativity
every sense of the
and
word.
Not a lot of positivity. So
No.
Germany's not in a good place, is it? I mean, that's a bit of a sweeping generalization, but the German aviation market is having some challenging times, isn't it? Not
it
just
is, and
the domestic.
Lufthansa have got another 3-year turnaround plan. That's absolutely fine. They'll probably head for some industrial trouble as well during the winter because the unions aren't going to be happy with what's being suggested. So they'll have a couple of days that they take off in February and March for an extra holiday. And look at what's happening in Finnair. Their Northeast network, Northeast Asian network, just so sad because it was a brilliant product. And I won't say it because he's just on here, but it is true. Helsinki was a great transfer airport for access to Asia. So it's just so frustrating when airports and airlines invest in something for so many years and a rug is pulled up from under your feet. It's just it's just so distressing for everyone, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure. Helsinki will have its day again. But I agree, is and was a great airport to transfer through, particularly coming from the north of the UK. Okay, let's move on then. Eddie, we've got some data from you here to share. There's we could have a whole webinar probably, I think, just talking about what the story is here. Do you want to explain to us what?
Yeah, sure. I can try and summarize this one quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, I was looking at two questions. One was, do airlines want new aircraft? And I think the answer there is yes, they do. The order book says so. It's at record levels. And of course, the frustrations of airlines that aren't getting aircraft sort of demonstrates the fact that, yes, they want aeroplanes. So where are they? Here, I've just provided some data. I was looking at the number of deliveries done back in 2018, which was probably the last year before we started to have wholesale disruptions. So we had just under 1,800 aircraft delivered that year. 2023 was the year when I guess things were, there's a foundation going forwards in terms of a bit more stability, although not without its disruptions, of course. Then we had some projections for what would be delivered this year at the start of the year for 2024, and it still wasn't back to the 2018 levels, but it was an improvement on 23. And because of what's been happening throughout the year with supply chain issues, with Boeing's issues, etc., we've had to revise that target, and that came down in August. It came down again in October. So in October we're down to just under 1,200 compared to, so it's even less than in 23. And the actual figures to the end of September were at 828. So both manufacturers, all four manufacturers, are going to have to pull their socks up in order to hit even the revised target.
It's a very busy last quarter, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, I'm working these numbers out here. So the revised October number was 1,171. At the end of September, end of the third quarter, we were at 828. They've got to do circa 350 more to get to their year-end target, which is about 40% more than of the whole target. They're not going to do it, are they, Eddie?
Well, I mean, there's usually at the very end of the year, there's a whole bunch of stuff goes out the door on the 29th, 30th, and 31st of December, which helps them meet their monthly targets. But yeah, it's a tough ask. Now, if depending on what the results are today on Wednesday, with over in Seattle, they might be able to, ramp up again, although it'll probably have to take some time again after a month's stoppage. So yeah, they've got their work cut out, but I'd like to think it's a target that they can address. And of course, the airlines want that to be addressed because they've placed the orders. Some of the aircraft are already way behind schedule. They've been sat around for a while, and they need to get delivered. So.
And you were saying there's fuselages that are 5 years old that are still yet to be completed. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we're looking at if you look at the new 777-9, I think there's already 30 airframes built. They're still building. They won't. I mean, some of them have been built since 2020, 21. So by the time they get delivered in 26, 27, yes, they'll be 5. A lot of the Maxes that have been delivered of late, they were 2019, 2020 vintage. So yeah, there's some aircraft. I mean, they're being delivered at 0 time and they look as good as new. But they've been around hanging around the Boeing inventory for a while.
You mean they're like a fine wine they've been growing with?
Mature, yes.
How frustrating from an airline perspective, though, isn't it? That
not just the airline, Boeing. I mean, you've got a product, you've invested in the raw materials, you've paid the labour, and you can't realise the cash because you can't deliver it. wow, what a mess.
Yeah, it's the deliveries that count. That last, handing over the keys and the paperwork and the last slug of money as well. So,
It just, I mean, that this feels like a really you're just under 1200. October revision feels really optimistic, doesn't it? When you factor
Yeah,
in a
I'd
month's
almost
shutdown.
wager that helicopter behind you, Eddie, that they won't.
I'm optimistic they can get there, because there's usually a fourth quarter push, especially
Yeah,
in December. Again,
yeah.
for accounting purposes as well. So
Yeah,
it's
sure.
it
Christmas
helps.
bonuses will be contingent on making it
Or
all
if
come
ever
together.
if ever there was a time to change your accounting year to the end of March, this might be it.
Yeah, maybe.
So
We're not cynical at all, are
we just
we?
we just thought it was interesting how they're struggling to do what they did even last year, and then
Yeah.
we go back to 2018, and we're a long way off. So I mean, the second question I was looking at was, okay, so how soon can they fix that picture? And that probably moves on to the next slide.
Yeah, yeah. Back to the slide deck. Okay.
Yeah, which is the actual aircraft production rates. And again, here we've just been looking at how quickly they can ramp up. Now, I mean, some of the figures, I mean, for the Max and the 76 and the 777, the actual production rate at the moment is 0 because of the work stoppage. But obviously, after today, that might be different. But again, looking at what they were producing in terms of a monthly rate prior to the pandemic and where they are today, you can see that they're still quite a way behind. Now they've all got plans to get to those higher levels, and for some of them, it looks much more manageable than for others. But it's a gradual, the word is always a gradual ramp up, or getting through certain issues. I mean, Boeing is restricted on the Max by the FAA authorization. But even if they get up to a full rate, they'll be delivering 50 per month in 2026, which is, Airbus is heading towards the 70, 75 mark by 2027. So, it's still not quite, matching like for like, which is what they were doing beforehand. So, can they get there? It will take time. And of course, because it will take time, I guess some of the airlines will still have more frustrations. But then, it means that some of those older aircraft will continue to be needed to plug any gaps.
And if you then sort of take that a step further to where are those new aircraft going? You've got the Indian market, for example, that from about 2027 should be taking 2 brand new aircraft every week.
Yeah, I think it's already started, hasn't it? I mean,
it's ramping up, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's not at that rate. So for them to be able to, are they going to get the aircraft that they're expecting?
I think that's the really stark thing for me, that you can see that there's a problem, and they've obviously got plans to get caught up with themselves and deal with the backlog. But that doesn't take any account of the fact that there's a massive pipeline of deliveries across all of these markets: India, Saudi, Indonesia, where there's huge aspirations for growth, or in some cases, really strong growth coming, being driven by the economy in India, for example. It just all feels quite tenuous, doesn't it? That supply is going to be able to match demand in some of these markets at the pace that demand is trying to dictate.
Yeah, I think it's a tough call for the manufacturers, and they're probably looking at the situation on a daily basis in terms of who gets what and when.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are some airlines who are probably happy to slow down the delivery rates, for their own reasons, and
JetBlue are in that space, aren't they? They pulled back their order.
Yeah, but there's always going to be somebody to step into that space, So the Ryanairs are always screaming for more aircraft. United want to see all their aircraft delivered this year and next year, and so it's rearranging the furniture, isn't it? Moving things around.
Let's just hope it's not on the Titanic.
So yeah, there's we're still seeing a fair bit. I mean, it's growth, but it's slow growth. A lot of it is, what is coming on board is probably just replacing some stuff and feeding
Mhm.
some. But some of that replacement isn't happening because airlines need that capacity.
Yeah, and I think actually, you mentioned this earlier, didn't you, Eddie? That there are still aircraft being delivered. We're not.
Well, yeah, it's still
Um,
nearly
there is
1,200. So
there is a steady stream still
yeah,
still coming off the production lines and getting out there to customers.
yeah. But it's again the ones that aren't being delivered, they're having to be um, uh, replaced by existing equipment, and of course some of that probably needs an overhaul, interior reconfig, and in order to keep pace with the new interiors that airlines are taking delivery of, because that's a whole competitive market in its own right, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's costing somebody somewhere down the line.
No doubt about that. And ultimately, it's going to cost the
Costing us.
passenger, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's going to cost us ultimately. It's hard to imagine that fares will we look back at our perceptions of this period and think, oh gosh, fares were quite reasonable then. I suspect we might. I think fares are only going one way, aren't they? And it's not down.
No.
Okay, one final slide to have a look at. We're just almost at the end of our time, but I think we've got time to just have a look at this one. What we've got here is very, very relevant given what we're saying about delays in deliveries, challenges with the supply chain. Airlines are battling on lots of different fronts, aren't they? I mean, they always have done, and they'll continue to. But we've seen some challenging cancellation rates, haven't we? Now this is just data here for the 787 fleets, but this is really starting to impact on airline performance operationally, John, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and you can see it's from June onwards. There's more activity. There's more action going on. It's a busy period for cancellations, and I suspect that will continue through the winter as well. I mean, in the good old days, 98.7% dispatch reliability is what you expected. And while some airlines have managed to hit that, then others have not. You need to balance this data out in the context of aircraft utilization as well, and how many hours each airline is trying to get off that particular aircraft type. Without casting aspersions, I would think Air India are not exactly working their 787 fleet too heavily if they've only got that type of cancellation rate. But you can see there's some global brands that are being impacted by this, and it's something that is not going to go away, and it helps explain why BA made that decision 2 weeks ago when they got 5% of their 787 fleet being cancelled.
Yeah, and we're gonna continue to see that, aren't we? Through the winter, these kind of quick decisions, pragmatic decisions about trying to protect the operation and prioritize markets. I guess in the same way that when we see an airline launch a new route and it doesn't work, they don't hang around. They pull the route and carry on and move on. And so are we? I don't think we're saying there's going to be a winter of disruption ahead, but there are challenges for sure, aren't there, that are going to impact on.
Every day brings a challenge to the industry. It just might be
does.
late passengers, weather, technical fault, fog, whatever. It still carries on.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I think we're out of time. We're just heading 1 o'clock. For those of you who don't know, we always send out a copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar so you can listen back to anything. And as ever, feel free to reach out to us if you have any further questions. So yeah, it just remains to say thanks very much to Eddie for joining us and sharing your fascinating insights on your part of the market. And thanks again, John, for
Pleasure.
your interesting insights as ever.
Thanks, Deirdre.
You're welcome.
Great, thanks, and we'll see you all soon. I think we're back in mid-November, just 4 weeks away, which I'm sure will be here before we know it. We won't quite have the Christmas lights up by then, but we'll be thinking about it for sure.
You will.
Okay, thanks everybody,
All right.
and goodbye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.